Sir, you need to step back from that door right now.
That's my apartment! Get away from my door!
Not anymore, it isn't. Not without an appointment.
Vanessa! Vanessa! Open this door right now.
I can't let you in tonight, Emmett. Please just go.
I've been awake since yesterday, pulling a woman out of a burning building. Now there's a stranger drilling into my own front door.
There's a notice on the mailbox. It only has your name on it.
He was already reading it over her shoulder, the locksmith's drill still buzzing behind him. Eviction. His name. Nobody else's. What the hell is this supposed to mean, Vanessa? I don't know. I swear I don't know anything. You're on this lease. We signed it together. Both our names. Same pen. His voice cracked, not from fear yet, just disbelief slamming into a wall. So why does this paper only have mine? A downstairs neighbor had drifted into the hallway with her phone already up, filming, and somewhere behind Vanessa, a second cat screamed and bolted deeper into the apartment. Maybe the office made some kind of mistake. A mistake doesn't drill a new lock into one name and leave the other person standing in the hallway with the cats. He grabbed the door edge and pulled. The chain snapped taut, cutting the gap in half. Let go of the chain. I need Josie's things for this weekend. Something crossed Vanessa's face then, fast, and gone before he could name it. And behind her, half in shadow, a second silhouette shifted near the hallway closet and went still. This isn't the time, Emmett. Please, not tonight. Tell me why it's never the time lately. He heard the compliance officer's radio crackle somewhere below on the stairs, a dispatcher's voice reading off an address that was his. Who is that behind you right now? Nobody, just, please, back up from the door. The locksmith straightened up beside him, drill still in hand. Sir, once this box is on, you're going to need to clear the hallway. Emmett didn't move. There is a man drilling my family out of our own home. Your name is the only one on the file, the locksmith said, almost gently, like he'd said it to 100 other men on 100 other nights. That's not something I control. Vanessa. Emmett put both hands flat on the frame and leaned into the gap, and for the first time, his voice went hard enough to stop the hallway cold. There's a county lockbox going on to my door and a stranger in my apartment behind you, and I am asking you, right now, to let me into my daughter's room. Her stuff is fine. Nothing's happened to her stuff. Then open this door and prove it to me. The chain stayed on. Somewhere below, a second radio crackled, and this time, the words came through clear enough for both of them to hear. A minor listed at this address, flag for a welfare follow-up. Emmett went cold all over. Did you just hear that? They think Josie lives here full-time. They think there's a child inside this apartment right now. There isn't, Vanessa said, too fast, her knuckles white around the doorframe. Josie's not here. I promise you, Josie's not here. Then who's the second person standing in my hallway closet? He shoved his boot into the 4-inch gap before the door could shut, and for one full second, neither of them moved. His boot wedged against the frame, her hand braced against the chain, both of them staring at each other through a gap too narrow for either truth or forgiveness to pass through. I kept the cats safe, she finally said, her voice gone thin. That has to count for something. He looked at her through that narrow gap, both animals clawing against her arms, the drill still humming behind him, and understood in a cold and sudden way that she was not confused, and she was not scared of a stranger in the closet. She was rehearsed, and she had been rehearsing this exact door, this exact lie for longer than he wanted to think about. Emmett Sawyer was 39 years old, and he had spent 14 years as a city firefighter, the last 6 of them running a rig out of a station. 2 miles from the apartment he now could not enter. It was work that asked everything of a man's body and gave him, in return, a kind of steadiness almost nothing else could. He had pulled people from places no one should have to be pulled from. He had never once missed a shift, never once shown up compromised, never once been the reason a call went wrong. His captain would have said if anyone asked that Emmett Sawyer was the last man in the department you would ever doubt. His daughter Josie was 9, sharp-eyed and quiet in the way of kids who notice everything and say little. And she split her weeks between Emmett's place and her mother Meredith's, a schedule the divorce had settled 2 years back, without much bitterness left in it. Josie loved the 2 cats with the specific fury small children reserve for animals, and she loved her room in the apartment, the one with the star stickers on the ceiling that she and Emmett had put up together on a night off. Vanessa Kirk had come into his life 18 months ago, warm and funny, and, he had thought, exactly the kind of steady he wanted around his daughter. They had signed the lease together. He remembered signing it. He remembered both their names going down on the same line, in the same pen on a good day. He had proposed to her 9 months into it, on the roof deck of the building, in front of both cats and a string of lights he'd spent an entire off day untangling, and she had cried and said yes before he'd even finished the sentence. Josie had been there too, young enough to think the string lights were the whole point of the evening, but old enough in the way she watched adults. And she had liked Vanessa well enough at first, the woman who let her stay up late on weekends and never made a production out of being a stepmother-to-be. If there had been warning signs in those 18 months, Emmett could not, standing at his own locked door, name a single one. Vanessa paid her half of things, or seemed to. She went to work most mornings at a job she described only vaguely as consulting, and he had never pushed, because pushing had never once seemed necessary. That was the part that would come back to him later, again and again, in the weeks that followed. Not that she had lied to him, but how little effort the lie had required, because he had never once given her a reason to think that he was watching. And now, the eviction notice in his hand had one name on it, and it was his. He slept that night at the firehouse, on a cot in the bunk room, still in the clothes he had worn out of the burning building, because he had nowhere else to be and no key to get there. In the morning, he called the property management office, certain a 15-minute conversation would fix a 15-minute mistake. It did not go that way. A clerk pulled his file and read him back a set of facts that did not match his memory at all. 8 months ago, the file said, the tenancy had been amended. Vanessa Kirk had been removed as co-tenant at the request of both parties, due to a routine income re-verification. Emmett Sawyer remained sole tenant of record. Every citation for lease violations over the last several months, unauthorized occupants, noise complaints, a guest policy breach, had therefore been issued in his name because his name was the only one on the lease. The eviction had simply followed the paper trail to its only listed address, which was him. I never signed anything removing her, Emmett said. I would remember that. There's a signature on file, sir. Whose? Yours. He did what most people do first, which is assume the truth will be obvious the moment someone actually looks. He drove to the office in person, badge still clipped to his belt from the night before, and asked to see the amendment with his own eyes. They showed him a printed signature page, his name in white on a hand that looked close enough to his own that a tired man in a hurry might have signed it without reading, the way people do with routine paperwork shoved in front of them. He could not swear it wasn't his. He also could not remember doing it. And the date on the page landed on a day he was fairly sure, though not yet certain, he had spent entirely at the station. The wall was this. On paper, the amendment was valid. The lease was his alone, and every violation attached to that lease was legally his to answer for. A judge would not care that he felt betrayed. A judge would look at a signed document and a sole tenant and a record of complaints, and none of that cared what Emmett actually knew or didn't know about who had been coming and going through his own front door. Then, 2 days later, the second blow landed, quieter than the first but no less frightening. Meredith called, and her voice had none of its usual ease. The school had flagged a welfare notice on file, she said, and she needed to hear directly from him before she decided anything, that nothing illegal was actually happening around their daughter. Emmett told her everything he knew, which at that point was almost nothing, and she listened without interrupting. "I'm not filing anything yet," she said finally, "but I need this cleared up fast, Emmett. If I sit on my hands and it turns out something was actually wrong, I won't forgive myself for it, and no judge would either. You've got until the end of the week to give me something real." Emmett stood in the firehouse parking lot with the phone against his ear and felt the ground move under the one thing he thought no one could touch. The department was kind about it, in the careful way departments are kind when they don't yet know how worried to be. His captain, a broad, unhurried man named Sal Mercado, who had run calls with Emmett for 6 years, pulled him aside and told him, plainly, that the house had his back, that nobody who'd worked next to him for 6 years believed a word of it, but that he needed to get himself a lawyer, and fast, because a housing case with the word illegal in it does not sit well on a firefighter's file, no matter how untrue it is. Emmett found the lawyer the way most people find help when they have nothing left, through someone who had been useless everywhere else being finally useful once. A firehouse regular, an old woman named Ida who brought the crew cookies every winter, had a niece who did tenant law out of a one-room office above a laundromat. Her name was Farah Doyle, and when Emmett walked in, exhausted and smelling faintly of smoke, she did not treat him like a lost cause the way the property office had. Farah Doyle was 36, had built her one-room practice out of exactly the kind of cases bigger firms turned away because there wasn't enough money in them. Tenants against management companies. Workers against landlords who counted on nobody having the time or money to fight back. She took Emmett's case the same afternoon he walked in, no retainer up front, because Ida had vouched for him in the particular, absolute way older women vouch for firefighters who've never once been late, bringing her empty cookie tin back. Farah had a habit Emmett would learn over the following weeks of reading every document twice before she said a word about it, once for what it claimed, and once for what it was quietly trying to avoid saying, and it was the second reading, most of the time, that mattered. She read the amendment twice. She read the eviction notice. Then she asked him a question nobody else had thought to ask. "The violations they're citing you for, do you have any idea what nights they happened?" "Some of them. The office gave me dates when I asked." "Give them to me." He recited what he remembered. Farah wrote each date down, and then she went still over one of them, and looked up at him with an expression he would remember for the rest of his life. "This date," she said, "the 9th. That's not a normal night for you, is it?" Emmett felt something cold move through him, because he already knew. "That's the night of the Larkin Row fire. I pulled a woman out of a third-floor unit. It was on the local news." Farah set her pen down slowly, like she didn't want to disturb what she'd just found. "Mr. Sawyer, they are accusing you of hosting an unauthorized guest and running loud parties in your apartment on a night. The local news was filming you carrying a woman out of a burning building 2 miles away. That is not a paperwork problem anymore. That is a lie somebody built, and they built it sloppy enough that it's already falling apart. We just have to catch it before it finishes falling." Farah pulled the news segment first. Easy enough. A local station's website still had it archived, 1 minute and 40 seconds of grainy footage. Emmett in his gear coming down a ladder with a woman wrapped in a blanket over his shoulder, a reporter's voiceover giving the timestamp right there on screen. It placed him, beyond argument, 2 miles from the apartment at the exact hour the violation notice claimed a stranger had been hosting a loud gathering in his home. But a video clip proves where a man was for 2 minutes. Farah wanted more than 2 minutes. She wanted to know what Vanessa had actually been doing with the apartment while he was gone, and that turned out not to take much digging at all. It took her one evening, searching under Vanessa's first name and the building's cross street, to find the listing. Cozy downtown retreat, hosted by V. 4 to 5 nights a month for the better part of a year. Photos of Emmett's own living room in the background, the couch he'd bought on sale 2 Christmases ago. The fire department's shift calendar still magneted to his own refrigerator. In one shot, Vanessa clearly hadn't thought to crop. She had not been an innocent bystander locked out of her own home the night of the standoff. She had been running a business out of it. It's not one bad night, Farah said, sliding the printed listing across her desk. This goes back almost a year, booking after booking, and every single one of them is timed for a night you weren't home. She wasn't guessing when to do this, Mr. Sawyer. She had a business plan, and you were the landlord who never knew he had tenants. It took another week of digging, quiet and patient, before the shape of it finished forming. A property records search turned up an eviction from 3 years back. A different city, a different last name variation, Vanessa's, buried under a maiden name she'd stopped using. She had lost a lease once before, over unpaid rent and a pile of debt that had never fully gone away. She had never told Emmett a word of it, and somewhere in the last year, drowning quietly under that old debt, she had turned their apartment into a source of cash the only way she knew how. Short stays, paid in transfers under other people's names, guests coming and going through a door she controlled, and Emmett almost never saw, because Emmett was almost never there. His whole devotion to his work, the thing that made him a man worth trusting, had been the exact gap she needed. The prior eviction, once Farah's investigator, finally ran it down, turned out to have its own small, ugly shape. 3 years earlier and 2 states away, Vanessa had rented a 1-bedroom under a hyphenated version of her maiden name, fallen 4 months behind after a job loss, and left owing the property company just under $6,000, a debt that had sat with a collections agency ever since, accruing interest, occasionally surfacing as a letter she'd learned to recognize by envelope alone and throw away unopened. She had never filed for anything, never disputed it, never paid it down, just carried it quietly for 3 years the way some people carry a stone in a coat pocket, forgetting it's there until the weight reminds them. When she and Emmett had signed their lease together, her credit report should have shown the debt. Farah found, digging further, that Vanessa had used a slightly different spelling of her own name on that application too. Close enough to pass a quick glance, different enough to dodge the exact match a background check would have flagged. It was not, Farah pointed out to Emmett, a single lie. It was a habit of small, careful lies, each one built to survive exactly the level of scrutiny most people never think to apply to someone they love. Farah found one of the guests, too, a traveling nurse named Priya, who had booked the apartment for a 3-night stay through a listing site under the name Cozy Downtown Retreat, hosted by V. Priya had no idea she'd been staying in a firefighter's home without his knowledge, and she was more than willing to talk. Once Farah explained why she was asking, she remembered a woman matching Vanessa's description, letting her in personally each time, remembered being told to keep her voice down after 10, and to use the back stairwell instead of the elevator, remembered a framed photograph on the hallway table of a man in uniform that she'd assumed, reasonably, was the host's husband. She still had the confirmation email, time-stamped, with a payment total that made Emmett's jaw tighten when Farah read it aloud. $140 a night, 4 nights that month on alone, deposited into an account that did not have Emmett's name anywhere on it. This isn't someone who slipped once, Farah told him, laying Priya's statement next to the listing printout. This is a system. She built a whole second income out of your apartment and your absence. And she built it carefully enough that you'd never have found it if the county hadn't come knocking with an eviction notice that happened to land in the wrong name. Emmett sat with that for a long moment, turning the confirmation email over in his hands. A stranger's polite 5-star review of a home he had paid the rent on for a year without ever once being welcomed into the arrangement. Then Josie gave them the piece that turned Emmett's stomach in a way none of the paperwork had. It happened by accident, the way the worst truths usually do. Emmett had finally gotten a supervised hour to collect some of his daughter's things, and Josie, walking her father through the apartment under a caseworker's watch, stopped in the hallway outside her own bedroom and went quiet in a way that was not like her. The door was open. The room did not look like her room. The bed was stripped down to a bare mattress. Her star stickers were still on the ceiling, but her dresser was empty, and when Emmett, confused, opened the hall closet to look for her things, he found them there instead, crammed into garbage bags, her clothes, her books, the stuffed rabbit she had slept with since she was 4. All of it shoved into a closet like storage nobody planned to visit. Josie stood in the doorway of her own emptied room and asked, very quietly, which made him doubt why her stuff was in bags. Farah found the answer 2 days later, cross-referencing the listing itself, which advertised a 2-bedroom unit. Josie's room, on the nights she was at her mother's and Emmett was on shift, had been the 2nd bedroom for rent. The building's keycard system backed it up down to the swipe, a minor detail by then, confirmation rather than discovery. A guest had badged in 6 hours before the night of the standoff, which was who Emmett had seen shifting near the closet in the shadows behind Vanessa. She didn't just use your work schedule, Farah said, and for the first time since Emmett had met her voice shook a little, with something that wasn't professional. She used your daughter's absence too. She packed a 9-year-old's whole life into garbage bags so a stranger could sleep in her bed for $140 a night. She closed the folder before she said the rest of it. If someone you trust ever treats the empty hours in your house, the nights you're at work, the weekends your kid's somewhere else, like opportunity instead of absence, that's the whole tell, Mr. Sawyer. People who see a child's room as square footage were never protecting that child. They were only ever waiting for the room to be free. Emmett sat in his truck outside the building for a long time after that, not driving anywhere, just holding the wheel. He had spent 14 years running into burning rooms to carry other people's children to safety. He had not seen the danger sitting in his own hallway closet, boxed up in garbage bags, until his daughter pointed at it and asked a question he had no good answer for. He called Meredith before he'd even started the engine, because she deserved to hear it from him before Josie said a word about it herself. She went quiet for a long moment once he'd finished. That's not a welfare flag anymore, Emmett. That's a documented harm to our daughter, whether you knew it was happening or not. She told him she was filing the motion that afternoon, not because she'd stopped trusting him, she said, but because a judge needed it on record that a child's bedroom had been used that way, and because she wasn't willing to wait and see what else might surface before this was resolved. Emmett didn't fight her on it. For the first time since the lockbox went on his door, he found himself agreeing with the person trying to take his daughter out of his custody. That night, at Meredith's kitchen table, because it was the only neutral ground either of them had, Emmett sat with Josie and told her, in the plainest words he could find, that none of what had happened was because of anything she'd done, and none of it meant her room stopped being hers. Josie listened with the seriousness she brought to everything, and then asked the question he'd been dreading since the hallway closet. Is Vanessa still going to be my other mom? He thought about lying to make it easier, and decided against it, because he had spent his whole life running toward the truth of a burning building instead of away from it, and he was not about to start lying to his own daughter, now that the fire was in his own house. No, he said, I don't think so. She did something that hurt our family, and I have to make sure it doesn't happen again. That's my job, protecting you and protecting our home. And I didn't do it well enough this time. I'm going to do it better. You didn't know, Josie said with the flat, generous logic of a 9-year-old. That's not the same as not doing your job. She thought about it a second longer, the way she did when she wanted to get something exactly right. You still saved that lady from the fire. You still came for my stuff. That's the job part I care about. Emmett didn't have an answer for that, one that didn't make his throat tight, so he just pulled her into a hug instead, and let it be enough. Word of Farah's subpoena traveled faster than either of them expected, and the reason it traveled at all had a name. Corey Bassett managed the building, had managed it for 6 years, and had grown up 2 streets over from Vanessa, close enough that when she needed a favor with the tenancy amendment, she had known exactly who to ask. Corey had drafted the paperwork himself, backdated it, filed it in the property system as routine, and never once expected anyone to look closely enough to notice that the signature page's file metadata carried a creation date 8 months later than the date printed on the document. It was a small, careless error, the kind a man makes when he has done a favor a dozen times before and stopped being careful about the details. When Corey learned that tenant records had been subpoenaed, he did not wait to see how bad it would get. He went into the building's management software late one night, alone in the leasing office, and began deleting the keycard logs Farah had already copied but not yet filed with the court, on the theory that a record nobody could produce a second time was a record that had never existed. He was 2 months into the log when the system flagged the mass deletion and locked him out automatically, a security feature he had forgotten the company installed after a data breach the year before. It was not skill or virtue that stopped him. It was an accident of bad timing, but he had done real data damage before the lockout caught him, and the only reason it did not matter was that Farah, moving faster than Corey had guessed she would, had already filed an emergency motion to preserve evidence the day after she found the metadata discrepancy, and the court order had gone out that same afternoon, hours before Corey ever touched a keyboard. He had tried to burn down a house that was already standing in someone else's name. Corey's second move was uglier and closer to the ground. There was a doorman at the building, an older man named Reuben Cole, who had worked the front desk for 11 years and noticed, in the quiet way people who sit in lobbies all day tend to notice, far more than anyone gave him credit for. Reuben had seen Vanessa buzz in strangers on Emmett's overnight shifts more times than he could count on both hands, had seen her carrying cash-stuffed envelopes to the mailroom, had even once helped a confused out-of-town guest find the elevator to an apartment he assumed belonged to a hotel. When Farah's investigator came asking questions, Reuben told the truth without hesitation, because it had never once occurred to him not to. 2 days later, Corey cornered him by the loading dock and made it plain, in the careful language men like Corey use when they want deniability, that doormen who caused trouble for tenants sometimes found their hours cut, and that a man, 11 years from a pension, ought to think hard about which side of a dispute he wanted to be standing on. Reuben did not scare as easily as Corey hoped. He had raised 4 kids on that job and buried a wife while still showing up for every shift. And he told Corey, plainly, that he had already given his statement, and he was not in the business of unsaying true things for a man half his age with soft hands. But he went home that night, rattled anyway, and he called Farah before he called anyone else, because he wanted a record of the threat on file before Corey could claim it. Never happened. "They're panicking," Farah told Emmett, when she laid out both moves, the deletion attempt and the threat to Reuben. "People don't destroy evidence and lean on witnesses because they think they're going to win clean. They do it because they know exactly what the evidence shows, and they're out of better ideas." She slid a folder across the table. "We have the preserved logs. We have Reuben on record twice now, once for what he saw and once for how they tried to shut him up. We have the metadata on the forged amendment. And we have a news clip with a timestamp no one can argue with. Your fiancée didn't build this on quicksand, Mr. Sawyer. She built it on the assumption that nobody would ever check. Everybody checked. Vanessa came to the firehouse 2 nights later, waiting in the parking lot when Emmett's shift ended, and for the first time since the door had closed on him, she looked frightened instead of rehearsed. She said she was sorry. She said it fast and messy. The debt, the fear, the old eviction she'd never told him about, all of it spilling out at once like she'd finally run out of road to run it back on. She said she never meant for it to touch Josie, that she'd have stopped if she'd thought it through, that she loved him, that they could still fix this if he just told Farah to slow down. "Slow down," Emmett repeated. "You put my daughter's whole life in garbage bags to rent her room to strangers, and you want me to slow down?" "I panicked. People panic, Emmett. You didn't panic when you had Corey backdate a legal document with my name forged on it. That's not panic. That's a plan." He looked at her a long moment, tired in a way that went past the shift he'd just worked. I keep waiting to feel something other than this. I don't. You want forgiveness for using my job, my apartment, and my kid's bedroom to run a hustle you were too ashamed to tell me about. I'm not the one who gets to give you that. Josie might someday, if you ever earn it. I'm done being the person standing between you and what you did. He walked past her to his truck without raising his voice, and that, more than anything he could have shouted, was the thing that finally told Vanessa the door was not going to open again. The housing hearing was held in a small courtroom that smelled of old carpet and coffee, the kind of room where ordinary lives get decided in an afternoon. Emmett sat beside Farah at the petitioner's table, showered, in a clean uniform shirt his captain had insisted he wear. Vanessa sat across the aisle with a lawyer of her own, and beside her, looking like a man who had aged 5 years in 3 weeks, sat Corey Bassett. There because the court had ordered him to answer for the property records under his management. The property management's attorney went first, and the argument was simple and, on its face, reasonable. The lease amendment was on file, properly executed, sole tenant of record Emmett Sawyer. The violations were logged against that tenancy. The eviction followed procedure to the letter. Whatever personal drama existed between Mr. Sawyer and his fiancée was unfortunate, but it was not the court's business. The paperwork spoke for itself. Farah stood up and did not raise her voice. The paperwork does speak for itself, Your Honor. That's exactly the problem for the other side. She entered the first document, the forensic metadata report on the amendment, and read the finding plainly into the record. The file had been created 8 months after the date printed on its signature page, on a computer, registered to the building's leasing office, under a login belonging to Corey Bassett. This document was not amended on the date it claims. It was backdated, months after the fact, by the building's own property manager, at the request of the woman who benefited from removing her name from a lease she was actively violating. Then she called Reuben Cole, and the old doorman took the stand in his work jacket, hands folded, unhurried. He described, calmly and specifically, the nights he had buzzed in strangers at Vanessa's request, while Emmett was on shift, the cash envelopes, the confused out-of-town guests looking for a hotel room that did not exist. And then, without being asked to embellish it, he described the conversation by the loading dock, Corey's quiet threat about hours and pensions, and the fact that he had called Farah's office within the hour to put it on record before anyone could deny it happened. The property management's lawyer tried to suggest Reuben was disgruntled, passed over for a promotion once, holding a grudge. Reuben looked at him with the patience of a man who had heard worse insults from better-dressed people. "I've worked that lobby 11 years, he said. "I've watched 100 families move in and out. I know the difference between a man who's late on rent and a man being framed for something he never did. This was the second kind. I'd have said so whether anybody threatened me or not. The threat just told me I was right." Farah called Corey Bassett next, and he took the stand with the stiff, unwilling posture of a man who had spent the drive over, hoping the hearing would somehow be cancelled. Under oath, with the forged metadata already on the record and nowhere left to point the blame, he could not hold the line his own attorney had clearly coached him to hold. "Did Ms. Kirk ask you to draft an amendment removing her name from the lease?" Farah asked. "Yes." "When?" A pause. 8 months ago. Around then. "And when did you actually create the document, Mr. Bassett?" "Not the date printed on it. The date, the file itself, shows it was created." His jaw worked for a moment before the answer came out low. "About a month ago, after she told me the county was moving on the violations. So the document that removed her name and left Mr. Sawyer solely liable for a year of violations he knew nothing about was written at her request, after the fact, to make it look like it had always been that way." "Yes. And the night you attempted to delete the keycard logs from the building system. Whose idea was that?" Corey looked at his own hands. "Mine. She didn't ask me to. I panicked. But the threat you made to Mr. Grant regarding his pension." Was that panic too, Mr. Bassett? Or was that a plan to keep him from telling the truth you already knew this court would eventually hear? He didn't answer that one at all, and in a room built for the plain reading of paperwork, the silence answered for him. Farah moved through the rest of it quickly, since the court had already heard the shape of it. The listing, the confirmation emails, the keycard swipes under Vanessa's own credential going back nearly a year. All of it preserved by court order the same day the metadata discrepancy surfaced, hours before Corey's deletion attempt. Then she played the news clip, 1 minute and 40 seconds, time-stamped, unedited, straight from the station's own archive. Emmett Sawyer in his gear, coming down a ladder with a woman wrapped in a blanket over his shoulder, on the exact night the eviction record claimed he had been home hosting an unauthorized loud gathering. He was not home, Farah said simply. He was 2 miles away, on a ladder, saving a woman's life. The only person who was actually in that apartment that night, letting guests in with her own key, was sitting at that table. She did not point. She did not need to. And then, because Farah believed a room remembers a voice longer than it remembers a document, she called one more witness, a small, straight-backed woman in her 70s named Delphine Okafor, who had needed a walker to get to the stand and had waved off help doing it. She was the woman Emmett had carried out of the fire. She had asked to testify herself, unprompted, when she heard what was happening to the man who had saved her life. "I don't know anything about leases," she told the judge, her voice thin but entirely steady. "I know that on the 9th of last month, that young man came through smoke I couldn't see through myself and carried me down 3 flights because my knees don't work the way they used to. I know exactly what time that was, because it was the worst hour of my life and I will never forget a second of it. If someone is telling you he was standing in an apartment across town that same hour, doing something dishonest, they are lying to you. And I would like the record to show that an old woman who owes him her life came here to say so in person." The room went very quiet. Vanessa's lawyer tried, in the time that remained, to argue the eviction and the custody question were separate matters, that whatever had happened with the lease had no bearing on Emmett's fitness as a tenant going forward. It was a thin argument, and everyone in the room could feel how thin it was. The judge, when she ruled, did not take long, and she said it in words plain enough that no one in the room could later pretend they'd misunderstood. "I have read a great many housing files in this courtroom, and very few of them come with a forensic metadata report, a corroborated witness intimidation complaint, and a firefighter's own department confirming his location down to the minute. This is not a close case. The amendment purporting to remove Ms. Kirk as co-tenant was created 8 months after its stated date by the building's own property manager at Ms. Kirk's request, specifically to shift liability for violations she herself committed onto a man who had no knowledge of them. The eviction proceeding built on that amendment cannot stand." She looked briefly at Vanessa and then at Corey, and did not soften what came next. "I want to be direct about something else, because it matters beyond this docket. An attempt was made to destroy evidence in this case, and a witness was threatened for telling the truth. That witness did not fold. This court does not treat those facts as incidental. The eviction was vacated in full, the violation record expunged, the amendment declared void as the product of forgery, and the tenancy restored to Emmett Sawyer alone, this time with the truth of it written down instead of a lie. The matter of the falsified document and the witness intimidation was referred for criminal review, naming both Vanessa Kirk and Corey Bassett. Vanessa did not look at Emmett when the ruling came down. She looked at the table, and for once there was nothing rehearsed left in her face at all. The criminal referral moved faster than Emmett expected. Corey Bassett lost his job within the week, the leasing office's own internal audit turning up 2 other tenants whose files showed irregular edit histories once someone finally thought to look. He was charged with forgery and evidence tampering, and the witness intimidation charge, built entirely on Rubin's calm, unshaken account was the one the prosecutor told Farah she was most confident about winning. Vanessa was charged separately, forgery and fraud tied to the sublet operation, and when the financial records were finally unspooled in discovery, they showed exactly what Farah had suspected from the start: a payment plan to a collections agency in another state tied to an eviction judgment 3 years old, filed under a hyphenated version of her maiden name she had simply stopped using when she moved. She had never told Emmett any of it. Not the debt, not the eviction, not the name. He had proposed to a woman he had known for a year and a half without knowing the one fact that would have explained everything she later did to him. Vanessa came for the last of her boxes on a Saturday when Josie was at Meredith's, by arrangement through Farah, so there would be no repeat of the doorway standoff that had started all of it. She moved through the apartment quickly, not meeting his eyes, and at the door she stopped and held out her hand, palm up, the engagement ring sitting small and bright in the center of it. "I don't want it," Emmett said. "I can't keep it either. Not after everything." She set it on the entry table instead, next to the bowl where he kept his keys, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. "I did love you, Emmett. I know that doesn't fix anything. Maybe it's even true," he said. "It still doesn't change what you did to my kid to keep a roof over your own debt. I hope you get square with whatever you owed, Vanessa. I hope you get square with a lot of things. I just can't be the one standing next to you while you do it anymore." He held the door for her, not unkindly, and when it clicked shut behind her, he sold the ring the following week and put the money, without much ceremony, into an account he'd opened for Josie the day she was born. Meredith's motion resolved itself quietly the same week the housing ruling came down, withdrawn once the court record made clear that the stripped room and the sublet operation belonged to Vanessa alone, and that Emmett had never known a thing about any of it. Meredith called him afterward anyway, because 2 years of careful co-parenting had taught her that some conversations don't end just because the paperwork does. "I don't regret filing," she told him. "I'd do it again if I heard the same thing tomorrow. But I want you to know I never once actually thought it was you, Emmett. I just couldn't take the chance that I was wrong." "I know," he said. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do. I'm glad she's got you looking out for her that hard." Back at the station, Sal Mercado met him at the apparatus bay, with none of the careful, measured tone he'd used the week the trouble started. Just a hand on Emmett's shoulder and a nod toward the crew, most of whom had somehow already heard the ruling before Emmett had a chance to tell them himself. "Told you the house had your back," Sal said. "Didn't say it to make you feel better. Said it because it was true." "I know," Emmett said. "I just didn't know how much I needed to hear it again. That's most of the job, Sawyer. Showing up for people even when they already know you will." He nodded toward the far wall, where the crew had, without telling Emmett, taped up a printout of the local news article about the hearing, right next to the old photo of the Larkin Row rescue, the two stories pinned side by side like they belonged together, which Emmett supposed they now did. Sal cuffed him lightly on the back of the neck, the closest thing to affection the man ever showed on shift, and went back to checking the rig, and Emmett stood in the bay a moment longer, letting the ordinary noise of the station, hose reels, the hiss of the compressor, someone laughing 2 bays over, settle back into something that felt like his life again. Getting Josie's room back together took longer than the legal case had, in its own way. Emmett found the garbage bags exactly where Farah's subpoena had said they'd be, still in the hallway closet, and he carried them into Josie's room one at a time and unpacked them himself before she came for her next scheduled weekend, so that she would never have to see her rabbit and her star stickers and her drawings of the fire station where her dad worked, balled up in black plastic like trash. He put the stickers back on the ceiling in roughly the pattern he remembered, close enough that she never mentioned it, and if a few of them ended up crooked, that felt, to him, like the least important thing in the world. When Josie came for that first weekend back, she ran straight past him into her room and stood in the doorway for a long moment, just looking at it, and then she turned around and hugged him, around the middle so hard he nearly lost his balance. "I thought it wasn't my room anymore," she said into his shirt. "It was always your room," Emmett said. "It's always going to be your room. That's not something anybody else gets to decide." The cats, at least, had never really left. Vanessa had kept them fed and healthy the whole time, the one true thing in a stretch of months built almost entirely on false ones. And Josie spent the better part of an hour on the floor of her freshly rebuilt room with both of them, purring against her legs, telling them, in the serious voice of a 9-year-old delivering very important news, that nobody was ever going to pack them into bags again. Delphine Okafor sent Emmett a card 2 weeks later, her handwriting careful and a little shaky, thanking him again for the 9th of last month and telling him she'd followed the hearing in the local paper and was glad the truth had come out the way it did. He kept the card on the refrigerator next to a drawing of a fire truck Josie had made him the same week, because it seemed like the right place for it. Evidence and love filed in the same small space. Reuben Cole, for his part, kept his job, his pension, and, as far as Emmett ever heard, a small measure of quiet pride he'd earned the hard way, the kind that comes from telling the truth when telling it costs something real. A month later, on a Sunday Emmett had off, he took Josie to the small diner near Larkin Row that had, unofficially, become their place since the fire. Mostly because the owner had recognized Emmett from the news footage and refused to let him pay for coffee ever again. Josie ordered pancakes she wouldn't finish, as always, and told him about a school project on structures that could withstand a fire, clearly still thinking about the 9th, even if she never said so directly. Halfway through breakfast, an older woman using a walker made her slow way to their booth, and it took Emmett a second to place her out of her courtroom clothes. Delphine Okafor, out for her own Sunday breakfast, 2 towns from where she now lived with her daughter. Closer to family since the fire had pushed the decision she'd apparently been putting off for years. "I thought that was you," Delphine said, beaming at both of them. "And this must be the daughter I heard so much about in that hearing." Josie, delighted to be recognized by someone from a real courtroom, sat up very straight. "My dad saved your life." "He did," Delphine said. "And a lawyer named Farah Doyle saved a good deal else. From what I can understand, between the two of them, seems like your family had quite a month." She patted Emmett's shoulder on her way past, the same easy, grateful touch she'd given him the night of the fire before the paramedics took her, and Emmett watched her go, thinking that of all the strange threads the last 2 months had pulled together, this was the one he hadn't seen coming, a stranger's gratitude turning out to be sturdier than a signed lease. Farah closed out that case the last time they spoke about it, standing in the doorway of her one-room office like she had the day they met. "People think paperwork is the whole story," she told him. "It's not. It's just the part somebody wrote down. The rest of it, you already know because you lived it." Emmett thought about that on the drive back to the apartment that no longer had anyone's forged signature on it. Radio off, windows down. The city going by the way it always had before any of this started. He thought about the fact that for a few weeks, a piece of paper had tried to tell the story of who he was, who he loved, who had a claim on his life and his daughter's, and had gotten every part of it wrong. He thought about the people who had refused to let that lie stand, an 11-year doorman who could have looked away and hadn't, a lawyer who read a metadata report the way other people read a confession, an old woman on a walker who came to a courtroom she'd never seen before because she remembered exactly what his hands had felt like carrying her down 3 flights of smoke. He pulled into the parking spot outside the building, cut the engine, and sat there for a moment before he went in no particular hurry now, because for the first time in a month there was nowhere else the truth needed to be. Upstairs, Josie had left her sneakers by the door, the way she always did on her weekends there, and the cats came to meet him in the hallway the way they always had, and the star stickers were still slightly crooked on the ceiling of a room that had never, for one single day, stopped being hers, no matter whose name a piece of paper had claimed to know. He stood in the doorway a moment, looking at all of it, the ordinary, unremarkable proof of a life that belonged to him and to his daughter, and to no one else, and understood that this, more than any ruling read aloud in a courtroom, was what getting it back actually felt like. Not a verdict, just a quiet apartment, 2 cats underfoot, and nobody left in it who had ever needed him to look away. A lease can erase a name from a door. It cannot erase who was actually home.